I guess this evening was prompted by an email that Mohsen Mostafavi had sent me a couple of months ago, where he'd written a text in his kind of role as an educator from Harvard Graduate School of Design, looking at, considering the future role of architectural education, how that's going to be affected by this, the structural changes that we've all undergone in the last few months in response to the health crisis. And so we've kind of gathered together a kind of group of academics, and in Betty Owoo's case, a recent graduate, so that the two other teachers I've got here to introduce are Beth Hughes, who's the head of architecture at the Royal College of Art, where the Architecture Foundation is based, and Tom Emerson, obviously of 6A Architects, but also Professor of Architecture at ETH Zurich. And Betty Owoo is one of the amazing young trustees at the Architecture Foundation. And yeah, as I say, I think now recently working with War Thistleton, but having been a graduate of the London School of Architecture, we thought she particularly would have a kind of perspective on these issues, given that the LSA is perhaps a sort of one model already for how we might adapt to these circumstances. Mohsen, your text is about to be published, I think, kind of in early September, but perhaps you could kind of give a brief précis of the argument before we sort of open it up. Very keen to have questions and comments from everyone in the room. So if you do want to make a contribution, please just let us know in the chat box to the side, and I will endeavour to unmute you. Mohsen, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Alice. Thanks everybody for being here. Yeah, so the text that Alice refers to is a text that is linked to a larger text related to questions of publications, books, and pedagogy. And in a way, it concludes that by trying to understand a little bit more the contemporary situation during the pandemic and potentially post-pandemic. I've been involved with quite a few institutions and essentially participating in discussions and watching these discussions unfold soon after everything went online, and really people making plans for the next academic year. Should we be online? Should we be back to the university or college campuses? Should we teach in a kind of hybrid model? There's a different thing called multimodal teaching. So there's a lot of discussions about the nature of education. At the same time, I've really also witnessed the complications that Zoom Academy has essentially created for so many students, so many faculty, so many staff, in terms of revealing a lot of inequities that are in place, because essentially the institution of the university or the institution of higher education has a certain dimension of openness and a certain dimension of addressing these questions of inequities simply because of the spaces that it offers, and it equalizes to some degree the differences between individuals by the mere fact that people can attend a cafeteria or go to a library, and that's very different than the kind of realities that people face at home. And this is the same whether you're a student or a faculty member, whether you're a mother or a father, you have children at home. So suddenly there are a great number of kind of complications that relate to the social and mental conditions linked to education. So that's like essentially a kind of precursor. But when we get to architectural education, not only do we face many of these issues related to the connection between, let's say, online versus physical and issues of inequity, but we're also facing the incredible complications of what it is to imagine architecture purely or merely as a virtual phenomenon, and what is the relationship of the way that we're working to the way that we were working before, which is basically very materially based. At the same time, most schools of architecture have, in terms of fabrication, making, so on and so forth, moved towards a computer or computational model of fabrication. So actually models in many places are not quite made the same way that they used to be maybe 15 or 20 years ago, where models are essentially assembled. But these nuances of the connection between physical things, our world of imaginaries as physical artifacts and their connection to the visual dimension is something that I think we are facing. Already, I think in many schools, models were becoming very elaborate and very complete in their own right. So I think every aspect of architectural education essentially goes through a certain level of rethinking during this period. And essentially, I think the argument is, how can we utilize the realities that have come about as a result of the pandemic and consider them in a kind of bracketed fashion as an opportunity, as a way of enabling ourselves to rethink. One thing that I would say is that it's been incredible to watch people be so amazingly generous during this period, in terms of sharing their time, in terms of participation, in terms of collaboration, in terms of friendship. And this, to me, is actually slightly different than the experience of pre-pandemic to some degree. So is it possible that this spirit of generosity, what Ivan Illich would call conviviality, would be extended beyond the pandemic, for people to actually be prepared to talk to each other, listen to each other, and really to allow for the possibility of rethinking, of reorganizing, because essentially institutions are incredibly difficult to transform, and there are internal resistances that are in place that we have seen them being, to some degree, broken down, or people willing to be more open to alternative strategies. So I think that that's one of the sort of key possibilities for sort of thinking in a different way. I think that obviously during this period, we started with the pandemic, and in the States, because of all the situations that we had with racism and then Black Lives Matter, and the fact that people weren't even calling things by name, therefore the idea of sort of people being anti-Black, these kinds of conditions that exist within institutions in some ways have also come to the fore. And it seems that we have an opportunity to also discuss those and open up the possibility of how we might really address a different kind of society that allows for a kind of more generous idea of sharing and collaboration and doing things together. So that's, in a nutshell, the sort of the overall argument. But of course, you know, there are lots of specific things that I'm sure we can discuss in more detail.
That certainly, that spirit of generosity that you're talking about, Mohsen, sort of resonates with me as, you know, as we come to the end of this 100 Days project, and which has entirely been made possible by the the generosity of people contributing for free to this model, which, you know, is obviously not the way that the Architecture Foundation was operating previously. And yeah, one wonders, you know, about the ethics of continuing in this form, and it's a challenge. Beth, I mean, you've been kind of in this sort of pastoral role with your students kind of for the last 4 or 5 months, going through this kind of adventure. What are the positives and negatives that you would draw out of this experience?
I mean, it's been quite astonishing. I'll never forget this cohort. It's been, I mean, in some ways, this kind of care that Mohsen is talking about is quite remarkable, from staff, students, faculty, the neighbours, everybody. It's been quite incredible and exhausting. and inspiring, and the work is surprisingly even more brilliant than ever. And I think actually I would advocate for care being an environment for brilliance more than competition, actually. So I think this idea of collaboration and care is super important to reflect upon. It's been hugely exhausting though as well, and I think there is a risk of abandoning models of teaching out of necessity becoming a more permanent way of educating, and I would absolutely resist that. I think as higher educational institutions, we absolutely must advocate for the potential to return to the studio and to use the studio, because beyond the kind of the making and the production that happens in there, it's a space of the socialization of knowledge, it's peer-to-peer learning, it's all sorts of things that go beyond kind of just what content you can deliver online on Zoom. There have been real positives. Yeah, you can bring anyone from anywhere around the world into the studio suddenly. And maybe in the face of the climate emergency, that's something we should talk about more. You know, there's a habit of RCA, ETH, GSD, flying people all around the world constantly. And maybe we need to talk about if that's actually responsible for us to do that. And maybe we can reflect on that. But I would still absolutely say that the studio space and students having access to facilities and having access to one another more than even the staff is fundamental, and we should stand strongly by it, because I think that there's a slippery slope of commodification of education, even more than has already happened, that is alarming, and we should stand together to make sure that that doesn't happen, I think, and argue for the importance of collective collaboration in a shared studio environment.
I mean, the Royal College of Art's quite unusual in, obviously, it's not just architects who are studying there, but painters and sculptors. And I imagine architecture is difficult, as difficult as the challenges are teaching architecture online. There is nothing compared with teaching sculpture or musical instrument making or jewelry design.
Yeah, and the School of Fine Arts and Humanities have had a really hard time. They've had a really difficult time. And so the college is working very hard to look at models how we can be, as Mohsen suggested, some sort of multimodal delivery where we will give students access to workshops. But teaching will continue online while this pandemic continues. But the toll of that on staff is just astonishing. So I think, and students, they don't have each other to work with each other as well. So the isolation and mental health care concerns are huge as well. So I think there are some things that are great about this new Zoom life. I look forward to working from home more regularly. But I would never advocate that we kind of mass produce architectural education and sell it online. I think that would be a travesty.
Betty, could I bring you in here? I mean, for those who don't know about the London School of Architecture, because obviously increasingly our audience is a global one, kind of for this series, could you kind of give it just a brief description of that model, and then maybe say something about your experience of studying architecture with a studio and without a studio, as it were.
So the London School of Architecture, it's a new model of education which was founded by Will Hunter 5 years ago now. So in 2015, the first cohort started. And the idea of the school was to widen access to architectural education by giving students a chance to earn as they learned through their education. So the school is split into 2 years. The first year where you work in practice 3 days a week, part-time, and that actually forms a core part of your modules for the first year. And then a more typical second year where you are, they call it the proto-practice, where you're working towards your master's and thesis project. And I think what makes it quite different, I guess, from anything that's offered in London at the moment is just the fact that there's such a intertwining of practice and academia, and throughout your whole time in the school, they are asking you to interrogate what it means to practice as an architect today and in the future, and they ask you to think critically about how practices operate, how the practice you are at operates, and how you would want to be as a future practitioner and whatever you go on to choose to do. And it's because of the nature of the school, of the different practices everybody works in, it's quite a large network of practices that are involved in the school. So even before this whole like Zoom kind of life that we're going through now, because of the network nature of the school, we had lots of people coming in all the time to share like their experience of practice and how they think architecture goes and things. And it was a really great network and resource to be able to draw upon when we had to go into lockdown and the school closed. And what's also different about the school is that the school didn't actually have studio space at all for the first 3 years of its existence. So as Will Hunter liked to say, like, the city was our campus, and we had to go out and sort of inhabit space in the city and make that the studio space for us, which when it worked really well, but when it didn't work, it was quite challenging. But at present, the school now has a very small studio space in Hackney, which is a good place for us to meet and to collaborate with each other. In terms of my own experience of this whole time, I can really relate to what Beth was saying about, it was exhausting, but it was also, there were so many inspiring points of like being able to have access to people that you wouldn't normally have access to, and to be able to reach out to people. I think for me, like, as Mohsen was saying at the beginning, like it was just, people have been so generous of their time, and I had multitudes of tutorials every week with people I would never have even been able to speak to if it hadn't been for the situation. So it was really great in that regard. But the studio space really was the thing that I missed the most. I really missed the collaboration of going in, of like being with my peers, of being able to talk through our ideas, and having physical crits where we could see everybody's work in person, and have that kind of more immediate relationship with the work, rather than it being on a screen. You only see perhaps one image at once, and it's all quite detached. So I think, yeah, the pros of it were access to even more incredible individuals from the world of architecture and design to speak to us and share their knowledge with us. But the downsides were obviously losing access to our studio space and our culture of studio that we had, which was really strong before we had to leave. And then also, as Beth was saying, like the mental health toll, I think can't be understated. I think a lot of my peers and myself struggled with mental health during this time. And I personally at the moment can't see how something like this can carry on without more support for everyone that's involved, from like the lecturers and the academics delivering the courses and the students as well.
Thank you, Betty. Tom, I mean, Mohsen mentioned this this kind of topic of the digital and the analog, which I thought maybe you could pick up on, because I mean, your teaching practice, first at Cambridge, I think, and then at ETH, has always been very rooted in making things a one-to-one. And yeah, now you've always kind of been insistent on that act of building at the center of sort of education. How readily do you think we're able to adapt to an all, what seems to be necessarily an all digital teaching culture?
Well, I mean, maybe I would say that I don't think we do have to adapt to a completely digital teaching culture. I think that the digital teaching culture will continue to be with us, but I suspect that we will be in a kind of mixed mode from here on in, and then depending on the near future, mid-future, long future, the balances will shift around. But I think it's unlikely that there's anything quite as extreme as the last 6 months coming up. At least I hope not. And I would say that the act of building, to me, is in the end, in teaching, the act of making things is often an alibi. Actually, I'm not that interested in people being kind of amazing makers or craftsmen or anything like that. It's an alibi for collaboration. And that's the main motivation, is that when you go and make something, design something and then make it, the scale of it more or less determines that you have to do it in a group, and that group has to then learn how to think intelligently, collectively, and then and evolve modes of design and modes of operation which are beyond the individual. And that's the main motivation. That is not entirely lost online. It is possible, and it changes, and it has its sort of awkwardness and all of that. But I think as Beth has said, and Betty has said, I think that the last 6 months has produced actually some really surprising kind of human moments, the kind of generosity, but also moments of imagination, where the imagination has caught the space and really been extremely productive. I am looking forward to the fact that we're going back physically in now, I think it's just a few weeks from now, at ETH. Mohsen's text about education is a very wide-ranging one, and it covers lots of issues from the process, you know, and the studio, the analog, the digital, all the way through to social justice and so on. But one of the things that it brings up is the differences in institutions and the kind of the respective responsibilities that they all carry. And the thing that's, I think, for me, very interesting about teaching at ETH is it's a public state-funded school of architecture. There is a fee, but it's nominal. It's almost nothing. I mean, it's certainly nothing that will give you that will give graduates terrible debt, and it's also non-selective. So it means that it's a sort of very kind of open platform in relation to Switzerland, certainly the country that it serves. Anybody who finishes high school can kind of walk in the door. And I think, compared with, let's say, maybe the North American experience, we're expecting a kind of surge in students this year. So we're kind of, there's a sort of almost a sort of different aspect to it. So we're all slightly bracing ourselves for not only being back in the studio, but being kind of also crowded exactly at the moment where we shouldn't be, you know. So there are lots of challenges ahead. I think that the mixed mode is possibly going to be more complicated than the online version of the last 6 months, but I think certainly worth pushing through with, because I think that particularly for architecture and maybe the fine arts as well, and applied arts, the RCA, our work, the subject of our work is spatial, embodied, material, and that's how it finds its politics and its culture. And architecture is, compared, let's say, with fine art, is always mediated. We never make the building, although occasionally we, as you've said, we dabble with it. We never really make the artifact or the environment that we're speculating, so it's always mediated. But those processes that we use in the studio, in model making, in drawing, in image making, can create a kind of latent architectural experience that can be shared amongst people in a room or an environment. Once it all goes online, it adds another layer of mediation. And I think another sense, I think that's something that Mohsen points out in the text, about an architecture that then becomes sort of entirely about image, which is something that was happening, that is happening in any case. The fact that, you know, we probably consume more architecture online than in reality. But nevertheless, I think that if the whole thing becomes online, I think we will lose out on some of the kind of both the kind of emotional, haptic, social kind of experience of being in a space with other people, which is really what we are tasked to do, is to create those spaces. So I think it's going to be very, very interesting going back, and I'm quite interested to see what kind of energy it restarts with, because I suspect that there's quite a lot of pent up sort of motivation that has been sort of, kept under wraps as we've had to kind of get through the last few months, kind of in confinement or at home or all the rest of it. So I think it's going to be, I suspect it might be a bit chaotic. I think we won't quite know what forms of behavior and what processes are best suited for the day. But I think that in itself is a really interesting space, kind of creatively and socially, to be in.
Thanks, Tom. Mohsen and Beth, I mean, maybe you could kind of respond to that in terms of how you see what you're looking forward to in terms of next year's the academic year, how you see it panning out, and what lessons from the last 6 months you're going to mobilize over the as in thinking about the next academic year.
I mean, yeah, it's tough because I think this generosity, if we continue to adopt it, becomes exploitative. So I think and so much of the generosity, so much of it was due to the generosity. So I think we have to be quite careful, actually. I think we have a responsibility to model the right kind of working environments for our students going forward, because they're also heading into potentially one of the worst economic crises that the world has seen for quite some time. And I think that's even further ripe for exploitation in terms of work practices. So I think it's quite important for institutions, whilst providing environments of care, also providing model environments for work ethics. So I find it quite challenging. We had amazing thing happen. We had alumni come in and give extra tutorials for students for weeks on end, just to help create that studio culture, which was brilliant. And we will ask that to happen, but in a kind of much more modest version, I think, going forward. It kickstarted a bunch of projects that we had long discussed, but then never have found the energy to make happen. And then we were like, right, we have to get them online, talking to each other as much as possible. So we're going to start this, and this initiative. And we just did them like that. They're just sort of sheer willpower. But I actually see some of the team online tonight, and I think they all kind of want to crawl under a rock and not talk to me for at least a month before coming back. So I think, yeah, we have to be careful about the kind of that balance of those things. So there were really wonderful things that came out of it that I will definitely take forward. But yeah, I think with greater caution and care for each other's kind of well-being going forward is really important.
We've got lots of amazing educators I can see in the room.
Yes, and, there's lots of them around.
More students. So it would be very nice to just to hear from them too, please. If you just let me know in the chat box, and I'll give you the mic. I mean, Tom was saying that he was anticipating a kind of numbers were going to be very strong, kind of going back. Is that your experience too?
Our numbers seem to be steady, yes. A few people have chosen to not return or to defer their offer, but then that was replaced with people asking if they could get a place. So, I mean, in some ways, the uncertainty of the job market makes it quite a good time to study, because I also think there's a kind of precarious world out there. I do hope we'll be able to return to some sort of version of normal. Sorry, Mohsen.
No, I was just going to say that what is sort of interesting is that as Tom said, not everybody is going to be online, and the experience of the next 8 or 9 months is actually going to be quite interesting to watch, because some institutions, their notion of risk is very different than others. And risk is not only a health risk, it's also a financial risk. So that's one aspect. The other thing is that with COVID, we are at different points geographically in relation to COVID. So Switzerland, for example, was early and has recovered, and the government, the state, has been very responsible, at least, or they've had the resources. So there's a certain sense of normalcy, whether this is a false one or not, that is there, which is not there in the American context, because you can go from state to state and there are vast differences in terms of the current situation with COVID, but also that institutions, there are certain institutions that simply can't afford, or they thought they couldn't afford, to go online and announce that they would go online immediately. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that actually the way in which institutions think over the next 8 or 9 months is going to be part and parcel of this issue. So one way is like the consequences of the online and hybrid and multimodal, but the other one is really about the role of different institutions and the way in which they work. One quick thing about my own personal experience is that, you know, I will be teaching online in the fall. And I also, having been, you know, in administration and dean until fairly recently, I haven't taught that much. And so I can tell you from personal experience that it requires an enormous amount of preparation. I don't feel at all confident, which I probably did, you know, 10 or 15 years ago, to think about something the week before and to prepare and to go into a class. The fact is, I think with this Zoom situation, you really do need to be prepared differently. And so how, for example, we organize classes, or what is the level of sort of knowledge when people are trying to make sure that the quality of education, despite the fact that it's on Zoom, is convincing, that is inspiring, that it will keep people engaged. I think those sorts of things are quite important and quite interesting, because I think when you are not on Zoom, your body won't return to the pre-Zoom condition in terms of research and preparation and the level of knowledge that is required, for example, for seminars. So I think these nuances of institutions and the intellectual project are also an important part of the next few months.
I mean, the Architects Foundation is not a university, but I mean, we have undergone a kind of similar journey in a way, in stumbling out of a situation where we were putting on 30 paid-for lectures a year, and now we seem to have done, you know, close to 300 live events over the course of 100 days, all of which are free. And that sort of fundamentally changes the relationship with our audience and fundamentally changes the kinds of conversations that we can make space for. Do you see, going to each of you, is there a potential here for your respective institutions to recalibrate their relationship with a wider public?
I actually wanted to say that I've been sort of very inspired, and I think I've told you this before, Alice. I've been really inspired by what, maybe it was a kind of crazy idea that you started and you didn't think what it would take physically in terms of like its personal toll on you and one or two other people that you work with. But I think, you know, the fact is that you've managed to put together an incredibly kind of coherent platform in a very short period of time. And it's actually astonishing to me that many other institutions haven't been able to do that. It's not that easy, and it requires a certain emotional, but also it requires a kind of commitment in a way, and that takes its kind of toll. But I do think that people might be more open to collaborating with other institutions than they have been. I think what Beth was mentioning about the fact that people don't have to travel, it does mean that it's easier to work with, you know, I work with Asia a lot, and that means that I've got sort of a lot of stuff happening at 9 o'clock at night. And so the idea of also extending the hours of the institution. For example, for us not to be only teaching during the time that's convenient for us in America, but also for a time that would be convenient for people in Asia and things like this. It means that actually the temporal dimension of the institution, what it is, when things can happen, who you can work with, all of those things is up for grabs to a certain degree. The issue though is that, and that's again, part of the reason for doing this paper, is that the discussion of the intellectual project hasn't been at the forefront. The discussion of organization, management, how do we survive, the sustainability of the model, I think that's been the primary thing. It's been a sort of organizational discussion. How do we survive? As opposed to really, this is also a significant intellectual conversation and significant intellectual project in a way for an institution. And I think that that would be, to make that more front and center would be, I think that would be a good thing.
I've been very struck that I think perhaps 90% of the contributors to the 100-Day Studio have been academics in some shape or form. And I think I've enjoyed the opportunity to talk to a larger audience, but it sort of suggests to me that there's an appetite there and that hasn't been supported previously. And I'm kind of intrigued as to how universities might develop that model.
One quick interjection. Tom has come to Harvard twice, and I've been during the time when I was dean, and I wanted to be there. And every time I've been away on some kind of a trip or fundraising. And so it's really, I'm so happy that in some ways I get to see Tom, at least on Zoom, when he came to Cambridge twice and I didn't get a chance to see it. So
last time was on Zoom.
Yes.
Yeah, we've been inviting Tom in for external examiner and critic for years, but he can, even though we're both in London together, he never has time. So he might.
South Ken is too far from Holborn.
Yes. I think, Ellis, I think it's interesting what you say in terms of reimagining your relationship to the public. But I really wonder if this is the opportunity for us to reimagine what architectural education is and what architectural practice is. And I think what became very clear to us is in the first month or so, the students were incredibly distressed at things like the loss of the physical show, the loss of the studio. They remain important factors, but as we watched the death toll around the world get to where it is now, or in the UK, 45,000 or whatever, however you want to count it, and we learned of people getting sick and people losing jobs, and all the students watched my kid hanging off my head the entire time that I was trying to teach them, and all of these things happened. I think we became more and more aware that actually maybe there's bigger questions that are really important for architecture to be asking, and for education to be asking. And the students started to demand that of us. And then with all of the racial issues emerging out of America and George Floyd's death, that became a very central discussion amongst the student cohort with some of the staff, and hugely important. And I think that's a radical change we're already making towards next year. Last year, we already included an explicit request from staff to respond to the climate emergency. But this year, we've asked the staff to respond explicitly to spatial justice in their briefing. And that I think all of our students have expressed to us very clearly that they want these questions to be more front and center of their education. And they think that architectural practice is behind in this regard, and that it must progress somewhere else. And I think we saw new practices emerging out of the great financial crisis, with things like meanwhile use becoming a kind of new form of area for young, small collectives to work on. We saw collective practice being a kind of term that suddenly we had Assemble and Rotor and all of these people suddenly talking about what a collective might be. And I wonder if this kind of series of systemic collapses across the globe, from the environment to COVID to systemic racism being kind of really brought out into the forefront, which are all interrelated and intersectional issues, if this is a moment for us all to, not just education, but everyone within our discipline, to reflect on those and to understand how their practice might shift to respond to it. And I do feel that education has a responsibility to lead in these questions, and the students are asking us to, at least at the RCA they are.
We've got a question from Irene Scalbert or comment.
Thank you, Alice. I mean, one has heard a number of times, and one does almost every day, you know, mentions of generosity, and from quite a few sources, of course, not only from the architecture teaching community. And I am in a way shared between two interpretations of that generosity. One is that the future would have finally arrived, and that we would be leading our professional lives online, as people like Martin Pauly were talking about, and many others, of course. That's here we are in the global village, and Mohsen and Tom can speak at last to each other. And the other version is that the architecture community is turning into the NHS, and that suddenly everybody is clapping and drawing rainbows, and that we are in this situation of emergency. And I quite agree with what Mohsen has said, that the opportunity is in a way to try to articulate intellectually what this change which came upon us could actually lead to. But I must say that, and I say this of course intuitively, but I am not overwhelmingly optimistic. Recently, I was cycling through Hampstead Heath. It was a beautiful day, and there is a place where there is a little bandstand in the middle of the heath. Under the bandstand, there were 8 musicians, young musicians they turned out to be students at the Royal College of Music. And they were playing for the first time after 4 months together, and they were playing the octet of Schubert. So they told me there was an audience of about 5 people, including myself, who were wondering when to clap. The whole thing was actually completely out of joint. It was delightful, but it was completely out of joint. And as we are talking, I am wondering how the architecture community actually compares to this rather miserable 8 people playing under that bandstand. But so optimism I find hard to sustain, though I wish I could have more of it.
But Irene, I've always loved your optimism. You're known for your optimism.
Yes, but not always, Mohsen.
We've also, I mean, what we haven't quite talked about, Bon, is just the other experiences of the students other than education that they get at when they go to university. That you know, in a sense, my experience was that it was as productive a period in terms of who you met and the friendships you made and the contacts you made for later life, and that entire experience of being kind of embroiled with a group of people for kind of 3 years. Betty, I mean, that must have been a challenge to kind of, has it been a challenge to feel you haven't had access to that?
You mean to things like the social networks and the
Actually, has it felt like an isolating period, when it should have been one that was sort of a much, you know, more sociable experience?
It definitely did, but I think the thing that definitely buoyed me was knowing that I had 6 months of a really amazing time with my friends in the studio being together. But definitely, like, you do feel it's kind of like you've lost the extension of, you know, how you can speak to people and help with your work and things, and to you know, draw on the culture that we'd worked really hard to build up. Because I was one of the reps for my year, and we had like these very long discussions over Google Meet about how we could bring back the culture we'd worked really hard to have, and trying to make it online. Maybe, oh well, we'll all come online at Tuesday at 11, have like tea together or something. And you know, while it was okay, it didn't have the same kind of immediacy. I think I really feel for students who are going to be starting next year. Maybe they're going to start digitally, because especially in your undergraduate course, like you've never done architecture before and you're coming into architecture school, and that's when you kind of make all those formative friendships and things that see you through your whole education, the people you meet and like the things that you learn. And I think it'll be a shame if those relationships can't be nurtured, because those are the ones that really help you through education, I think, and help to develop your skills, but also just your social experience, having a nice time at university, not feeling like you're on your own in a room trying to learn something you've never studied before.
Tom, I think you have your role's changing at ETH. Am I right? Next year, that you have a kind of oversight role over the whole academic program.
I'll be this time next year. I'll be dean.
I would do it.
Yeah, I relate to what you say, but I'm more optimistic than Irene, I think. I mean, I think that, let's say, on the social level, I think I completely understand what Betty says, particularly for things like first year, the young years, where actually, as you say, you know, your reason to be there is as much to do with meeting other people and falling in love and all of that sort of stuff, and then maybe do a bit of architecture on the side, if you can fit it in. And in the way that we've been organising it, and it's been very difficult, but essentially is giving priority to first year, spatially, but also in time, and then to second year. And then, so basically, when we run out of space, it will be the upper years that somehow are sent online, whereas the lower years where a lot of those relationships are being formed. And you have to bear in mind that also ETH is a huge school compared to British schools, about 2,000 students in our department. So it's a kind of a huge ship in terms of the numbers of people moving around and stuff like that. But I think that, so while I think that there will be a kind of a reconstruction of all of those processes, you know, kind of affected, of course, by the last 6 months. But I think that maybe what the last 6 months has done, and I think that people like Kunuletu have written about it already, is the fact that the pandemic has, to some extent, sharpened our awareness of many other global collective issues that were very, very hard to conceptualize, like climate change, like systemic racism, things like that. Things that, let's say, a lot of people found it very difficult to access the issue and to find agency in the issue. And COVID has been so direct in its impact on all of us that somehow it's, I think, been a kind of almost like a portal through which you can access these other issues. And I think that there will be, in many schools of architecture, I think an acceleration in the kind of the evolving of the curriculum. What is in, what's taught in history, what's taught in, how is technology kind of presented, what's its political status and financial status. I mean, you know, actually where Mohsen and I met was really when I started teaching at the AA, when Mohsen was chair and Irene was there. And it was really the sort of the peak of the parametric, the kind of growth of the parametric promise. And it was very, very exciting. People like Foreign Office were there and things like that. Late 90s, early 2000s. And then the financial crisis of kind of 2009, 2010 really sort of took a lot of the wind out of its sails, because it seemed suddenly that all of those digital instruments belonged to a kind of a big kind of neoliberal economy, that somehow you had to have all this kind of incredible incredible infrastructure, and then maybe the things that the kind of movements that Beth talked about, the kind of collective movements, grassroots thing, sort of evolved out of the back of the recession. And I think that now what may happen is a reevaluation of the kind of discipline itself and its core content will be precipitated, will be accelerated by the event we're going through. So as much as it's been kind of incredibly traumatic for many, whether they've been affected by it directly or just by the solitude, by all the kind of consequential issues, I think that there may be also something much brighter, kind of intellectually and imaginatively coming out the other end. So I feel quite hopeful that institutions will want to kind of harness that, and the people, I mean, institutions, I mean, of course, we're only talking about the people within them. So I feel, I actually like the sound of the quartet in Hampstead Heath.
Well, it was actually a bit of a privilege, to be fair. And I took a break on my working day. It was actually quite rather marvelous, to be frank. But I mean, from what you said, Tom, it seems that you are seeing this intellectual change, which Mohsen has referred to as happening already. I'm sure it's true in part because people are reasonably thinking about the consequences of the situation in which we are. At the same time, I must say, speaking for myself, I feel imprisoned by, not physically, I feel imprisoned by the COVID subject. Every day I open the newspapers and it's a bloody same subject. It's COVID, 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 COVID in every single article, as if there was nothing else happening in the world. Well, of course, many of us are getting on with our professional lives, doing other things, and those things are not exposed. It's as if, you know, if the newspapers is actually any analogy at all to our situations, it's a bit like the windows have been closed.
I mean, I think I'm sure that's true to some extent, but I suppose what I was saying is I think that the COVID thing, I'm not talking about what it is, like what content it's producing. I think that it's just been a kind of an event that has precipitated an awareness of other ones, which were processes that were at work anyway, in culture generally, in society generally, but in education in particular, but may have been precipitated, may have shown new ways of gaining access to the issue. And I think that that's where I think progress may be accelerated, things may change faster. I think even something as basic as our capacity to change has been proven to be quite remarkable. So I think that if we can change in the way that we did back in March, there are so many other changes that can be brought in without, which perhaps a year ago people go, oh, you can't, you know, that's too much too quickly. I suspect that now people's kind of confidence that an abrupt change does not dismantle everything that you stand for, everything that you know, but actually just moves it forward, I think is a kind of an exciting one.
I have to agree with you, Tom. I think, I mean, as we start, I'm reminded that as we started the year, the whole of Australia was on fire. Like it was literally on fire. It was the worst wildfires that country has ever experienced. Being an Australian, I was acutely aware of it. But it was like environmental catastrophe at a level that we had just thought unimaginable. And yet that didn't alarm people very much. But then COVID suddenly starts a really serious discussion about deforestation and the way that that's causing environmental destruction, that is releasing these kinds of diseases, that is causing a relationship with nature that is problematic. COVID brings out this conversation about systemic racism, but also systemic inequality in society in the way that everything is built and structured, because BAME populations and minority populations are unequally affected by them because of issues of access and equality. And I think it has given us this lens, this heightened sense of awareness of emergency, and no one wants to have to go back into lockdown ever again. We don't want COVID-24 to emerge, or whatever it might be called. And so I hope, jumping onto your optimism, Tom, that it makes more of us more aware and more conscious and more responsible going forward. Now, Irene, I share your concern that maybe everyone will return to their selfish capitalist ways as the minute the doors are open again. But I hope a greater percentage of us don't, and it's enough to make a difference, and that architectural education, architectural practice will be part of that change, and that we will start to have a greater understanding of our responsibilities towards these things. Because I feel like the impact on questions of equality and race have been far further discussed through what's happened with COVID and George Floyd than Grenfell. And Grenfell was a massive tragedy that was directly related to the architectural industry. But actually, I think the discussion around it has been more nuanced, sophisticated, and plural in the context of recent events than the context of Grenfell. Yeah. So I'm always pessimistic and optimistic at the same time, but I hope Tom's right that we can change a little bit as part of this process.
I think what you describe is certainly in the order of the possible. I mean, in my mind, it depends on the length of the crisis. The longer the crisis lasts, it's a bit like World War II. The longer the crisis lasts, the more likely substantial change will be. The shorter it is, the less likely we are to pay attention, I think, and return to the old ways. That would be my guess. But